I was forced out of my home just after turning 17, when my father chose to make room for my older half-brother William, who decided to move back in. William, the favoured son from my dad's first relationship, didn't want to live independently and preferred the comfort of our father's house. This preference was possibly rooted in his limited childhood connection with our father, as he was a child of a brief relationship that ended soon after his birth. Growing up, William was frequently at our house, more than what his custody arrangement mandated, or so it seemed. I remember his presence as constant, a perception perhaps amplified by my reluctance to spend time with him. Despite the legal setup for shared custody with his mother, William was distinctly closer to our dad, leading to many enforced interactions between us, much to my displeasure. My relationship with my dad had been strained since I was young, deteriorating further after the loss of my mother to lung cancer a few years ago. My dad's manner towards me was often cold and dismissive, contrasting sharply with his demeanour around William. It was clear I wasn't the son he wanted, which had become even more evident in the wake of my mother's passing. My father would readily reprimand me for trivial matters and was generally indifferent towards me, lacking the warmth he reserved for William. William, for his part, embraced his role as the golden child and often bullied me. He exploited his favoured status, knowing repercussions from our father were unlikely, no matter how he antagonised me. When I complained, the typical response was dismissive, reinforcing the harsh boys will be boys attitude and pressuring me to endure the bullying without objection. As William grew older, his methods of torment evolved from physical altercations to psychological warfare, involving his friends in belittling me at school. This social bullying was devastating, especially as it coincided with my transition to middle school, where social standing becomes more significant. William and his friends labelled me derogatorily, damaging my reputation and isolating me from peers, even those from my elementary school days. Now, 10 months after being kicked out, my father and William have come to me with a desperate plea to lie for them, to cover up a crime William committed, threatening their freedom. This request, after all the years of neglect and hostility, feels like the ultimate betrayal and manipulation. Growing up, I always felt overshadowed by my older brother William, who seemed to be everything I was not. Athletic, academically gifted, and the favoured child of our father. My high school years were especially tough because I couldn't really fit in until William graduated and left for college. This gave me some breathing room, though I only had a few friends and often found myself the target of bullies. At home, things were no better. Both William and my father often belittled me, undermining my self-esteem, despite my good grades and knack for science. My father was charismatic, which often allowed him to sway my mother's perceptions, convincing her that their harsh words were just playful teasing. Although my mother was kind-hearted and did her best to defend me, her efforts were largely ineffective against their constant ridicule. When William finally went off to college, I hoped for a respite from the constant negativity at home. Unfortunately, this hope was short-lived, as my mother was soon diagnosed with lung cancer, a devastating blow that shook the foundation of our family. Instead of bringing us together, this crisis seemed to strain the family bonds further. My father grew distant, not just from me, but from my mother as well, retreating into a shell of indifference that left me to manage household affairs alone while trying to support my ailing mother. The environment at home became even more challenging after my mother passed away. My father sank into a deep, uncommunicative state, barely acknowledging my presence. I did my best to maintain the household and reached out to my grandparents for support, fearing my father was battling depression. However, my concerns were dismissed, leaving me to cope with the situation on my own. During this period, William's visits from college would provide temporary relief from the hostility. Though he was far from warm, his behaviour was at least civil, a small mercy for which I was grateful. Despite these challenges, I strived to keep peace in the family, knowing that any confrontation would only provoke further criticism from my father. As I navigated this tumultuous family dynamic, I held on to the hope that someday things might change for the better. The experience taught me resilience and the importance of seeking support where possible, even in the face of ongoing adversity. After my mother's funeral, the dynamics at home took a harsh turn. My father, who had been distant and unresponsive for months, began reverting to his old habits, which unfortunately included binge drinking and resuming his derogatory treatment towards me. He would bark orders for me to handle all the household chores, tasks that my mother used to manage even when she was ill. With her gone, all responsibilities fell squarely on my shoulders. Balancing schoolwork and housework was exhausting, and any attempt to protest was met with reminders from my father that I wasn't contributing financially, so doing chores was the least I could do to earn my keep. It was a demeaning situation, but with no alternatives, I felt forced to endure it. The only glimmer of hope I clung to was the prospect of going to college. It represented a chance to escape the oppressive atmosphere of what was no longer a home to me, especially since my mother's passing had stripped away any semblance of warmth from the house. Living with my maternal grandparents might have been an option, but they lived far away, and I still had a year of high school left. However, circumstances changed abruptly a few months ago when my father, anticipating the return of William, his favoured son from college, decided to kick me out to make room. Despite William having moved out for college and settling elsewhere with his wife, my father was eager to welcome him back, even if it meant displacing me. William, who had moved away to build a life with his girlfriend, was now married and had a child. They decided to return home, and my father, with barely 4 weeks' notice, informed me that I needed to find a new place to live. William and his wife would take the guest room, and my room was to be converted into a nursery for their child. This arrangement was not just unfair, but also felt like a blatant dismissal of my place in the family. My attempts to argue with my father were futile. His mind was made up. He gave me a 4-week ultimatum to vacate my room. With no choice left, I moved out to live with my grandparents, leaving behind the house that had ceased to be a home long before I departed. I found myself in a difficult situation when the police began to investigate my father and his actions. Although I wasn't fully aware of any legal avenues available to challenge this at the time, the sudden urgency and my lack of trust in my father, who was capable of evicting me abruptly, plunged me into panic. In haste, I began searching for a new place to live, ultimately deciding to move in with my grandparents. I had hesitated to do so previously because they lived quite far, and I was still attending high school. However, with only a few weeks left until graduation, I felt I had no other viable options. Within days, I moved out, eager to leave before my Uncle William returned home with his family. My father showed no emotion when I left. He didn't even bid me farewell. As I departed with the movers, my grandparents drove a long distance to pick me up. They were ready to confront my father, but I discouraged them, wanting to avoid further drama. 10 months later, I was comfortably settled with my grandparents and hadn't spoken to my father since the day he kicked me out, nor did I have any plans to reconnect. I was preparing to start college in a few weeks, which was already arranged, leaving me with no reason to contact my father or William. Yet, unexpectedly, they reached out to me because they needed my help after finding themselves in a predicament. A few days ago, they visited, and despite my surprise, I agreed to hear them out due to their evident desperation. I learned that William had returned because he lost his job and was struggling financially, prompting him to move back with his wife, who preferred to stay at home with their child. They hoped to find employment easily, but the job market was tight, and William's skills were not unique, making it hard for him to stand out. Eventually, my father secured a job for William at his company, although it paid less than William's previous job. However, it turned out that William had been embezzling funds from the company for several months, and when this was discovered, both he and my father were implicated in the scheme. Their employer, a family business led by a close friend of my late mother, had not yet sued out of respect for her memory, but patience was wearing thin. My father and William proposed a desperate plan. They wanted me to claim they stole the money for my college fund, hoping this would garner sympathy and buy them time to return the stolen funds. This would prevent their immediate firing and potential imprisonment. Despite their audacity in making such a request after all the years of mistreatment, I refused outright. Their plan was absurd, and I was unwilling to participate in such deception. When I expressed my refusal, they became agitated, insisting I had to help them, but I stood firm against their unreasonable demands. The situation was dire, with the real possibility of them ending up in jail. And they seemed to think that an old grudge was preventing me from helping. But I corrected them. It wasn't about holding grudges. My father had kicked me out not too long ago. It was hardly a distant memory. More importantly, the reason I resisted their plan wasn't just personal. It was about integrity. The plan was fundamentally dishonest. I knew their employer personally. He was a close friend of my late mother and almost like an uncle to me. We had maintained a good relationship, and it was my mother who had recommended my father for the job when he was struggling. Now, not only had William made poor decisions that jeopardized the company, but my father was also attempting to cover it up, using me as a scapegoat. I found this appalling and couldn't lend myself to such deception. I advised them that it would be better to repay what they had stolen, rather than weaving a web of lies that could entangle them further. They were fortunate to even have the opportunity to make things right without facing legal consequences immediately. If they continued down their planned path, they risked a lawsuit they would surely lose, and jail was a definite possibility. When I tried to explain the gravity of the situation and the simplicity of the solution to just pay back the money, they didn't take it well. My father became particularly upset, refusing my counsel and demanding my complicity instead. But when I stood firm, denying involvement in their scheme, the emotional intensity escalated unexpectedly. My father, to my surprise, began to cry. It was an unusual sight. His vulnerability was something I had never witnessed. He expressed his disappointment, emphasizing that he had hoped for my support as his son, believing familial bonds would transcend past conflicts. William echoed his sentiments, pleading for my help because of my favourable standing among my mother's friends. They believed I was their last hope, the bridge to a solution that might be less severe than what reality might otherwise dictate. Despite the emotional pressure, I remained resolute. My suggestion was straightforward: come clean and return the stolen funds. Their reaction was one of frustration. They accused me of turning against them because of past grievances, not understanding that my decision was based on moral grounds, not revenge. The confrontation was challenging, but it was essential for me to stand by my principles. I encouraged them once more to take the honest route and resolve the matter transparently, even though they found it hard to accept. The conversation ended without resolution, leaving them to ponder the path of integrity I proposed. From a young age, my relationship with my father and William was strained, and they seemed disappointed with how I was handling the current situation. After our last conversation, they left, but the aftermath left me feeling deeply conflicted. The thought of them possibly facing jail time weighed heavily on my mind, stirring feelings of guilt even though I knew I didn't want to engage in anything illegal or unethical. The dilemma was especially painful because participating in their plan would feel like a betrayal of my late mother's memory. It would involve manipulating her friend, an idea that felt entirely wrong. Time was pressing. My father and William didn't have an indefinite period to settle their debts, intensifying the urgency of my decision. After much reflection, I resolved to maintain my distance from their illegal activities. It was a clear choice, driven by the need to uphold my moral and ethical standards. Engaging in such dishonesty was not only illegal, but an insult to everything I believed in. They had an opportunity to make things right on their own by repaying the stolen money without further deceit. This path allowed them to potentially preserve their reputations without involving me in a falsehood. Many people advised me to steer clear, not just because of the nature of William and my father's actions, but also because getting involved would haunt my conscience in ways it wouldn't affect them. Our fundamental differences in character and values reinforced my decision to stay out of it. If they tried to reach out again, I was prepared to block them. I had already taken steps to block them on all known contacts, but I anticipated they might try to reach me using different numbers or social media profiles. My grandparents supported my decision, reminding me that this mess was of their own making, and it was their responsibility to clean it up. Expecting me to help after years of mistreatment was unreasonable. 5 days after their last visit, my father attempted to contact me again. True to my expectations, he used a different phone number. I answered the call without realizing it was him, but as soon as I recognized his voice, I hung up immediately. His attempt to reach out confirmed my resolve to keep my distance, ensuring that I would not be drawn back into their turmoil. When I heard my father's voice on the call, I didn't react quickly enough to block him. This allowed him to send me a text. In his message, he admitted knowing I wanted to avoid further discussions, but insisted they were in dire straits. He explained that their employer was pressuring them daily to return the stolen money, threatening legal action if they failed. His plea filled me with guilt, yet I responded firmly, stating that I wouldn't assist him, and urged him to find another solution to his problem. After sending that message, I blocked his number, hoping he would understand my stance, though I was uncertain if he truly would. My greatest hope was that he'd act responsibly to avoid worsening his situation. Since then, I hadn't heard from my father, but my grandparents reached out to my mother's friend, the CEO, to gain insight into his next steps. We hadn't wanted to bother him earlier due to his busy schedule, and direct communication with my father or William was no longer an option. Thankfully, my grandfather managed to speak with him. The CEO expressed his intention to proceed with a lawsuit if the money wasn't returned soon. However, he also mentioned his willingness to forgive, influenced by his long-time friendship with my mother, though he couldn't simply write off the debt. He acknowledged the awkward position this put me in and apologised, which I appreciated, but reassured him that it was all right since I no longer lived with my father and believed that some consequences were deserved. The situation was still uncertain, but there seemed to be a consensus that my father understood the severity of his situation and would attempt to settle his debts to avoid legal consequences. During this stressful time, I had a meaningful conversation with the CEO, who reminded me of his offer made in the past through my mother. Should I ever need a marketing intern or a job, his doors would be open to me. This offer provided some comfort, affirming that despite her absence, my mother's influence continued to look out for my well-being. It was a small solace in the midst of turmoil, but it reinforced the ongoing support network I had, thanks to my mother's enduring legacy.